Next, on Lectures in History, University of Texas at Austin professor Madeline Hsu teaches a class about the 1965 Immigration Act and current immigration demographics. She describes how the number and country of origin for immigrants, visa holders, and refugees has changed over the past 50 years. Her class is about 90 minutes.
Good morning. Welcome to our fourth morning of the Gilder Lehrman Institute workshop on immigration history. So glad to see you all here again. So today we are going to talk about the immigration law that has been in place over half a century now, which has had a transformative impact on American society. And so the basic principles for immigration regulation laid out in these laws are the ones that are still with us today. Now, to remind you, the last major set of immigration restrictions prior to the 1965 Act were legislated in 1952. As we recall, the McCarran-Walter Act retained the national origins quota system, right, which was, and you can see from the summary of the national quotas allocated, all countries in the world got an immigration quota. This was in advance from the previous legislation, but as you can see, certain countries were greatly favored. Northern and Western Europe particularly still retained over 85% of the immigration quotas. And persons from Asia could immigrate, but as you can see, they were highly restricted. Asians were also the only group still to be tracked by race through the Asian Pacific Triangle. The McCarran-Walter Act added certain changes in terms of having preferences, which we'll talk about more today. The McCarran-Walter Act introduced a preference for people who had special skills in employment. Okay, it also adds a preference for relatives of U.S. citizens. Okay, and so these are becoming identified as priorities and as alternative ways to think about how we admit people apart from their race and national origins. Okay, so this system goes into operation. It is immediately subject to protest. In fact, the McCarran-Walter Act was vetoed by President Truman because it retained the discriminatory national origins quota system, was a big hurdle in terms of American foreign relations. And so we have a succession. All presidents, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and then LBJ, all wanted immigration reform. And so here we have a report issued by the Truman administration, Whom We Shall Welcome. Here we have a publication by John F. Kennedy. It was titled A Nation of Immigrants. Many people believe it was ghost-authored by Oscar Handlin, pressing for this idea of the United States as a country that can welcome and that can include and integrate a multitude of immigrant populations, really pressing for immigration reform. However, there is staunch opposition. It is increasingly minority opposition, but because of the way the committee structure in Congress works, it took a tremendous upswell in order for immigration legislation to finally pass. 1965, we see LBJ signing the new Immigration Act. He's on the he's right under the Statue of Liberty, right? He's surrounded here. You can see a couple of the Kennedy brothers. This is Lady Bird Johnson. And of course, this is in the wake of the assassination of President Kennedy. And immigration reform was a cause that Kennedy had really championed during his career as a senator and then when he became president. But it took LBJ with his savvy in Congress, but then also sort of the upswell of civil rights pressures to finally get the legislation through. Okay, now these are the terms of the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act. Okay, and as we go through this, you should consider for yourselves whether this is in fact egalitarian legislation. Okay, and one of the pressures was that we actually need to remove overt discrimination from our immigration regulations, and you can consider the ways in which this set of rules and processes for deciding who can immigrate legally to the United States will have an impact. Okay, there's 20,000 annual caps for Eastern Hemisphere countries. This is now applied to all countries. It is now up to about 25,000 per country. So every country gets the same cap, right? Okay, there is a preference system, all right? There's a set of priorities. It has to do 75% of immigrant visas go to family, 20% are based on immigration by employment, and 5% allocated to refugees. Okay, now note this, right? So a lot of times people have this conception that people are here, they didn't have authorization, and then the complaint is that, well, you should have just gotten in line. Right? But one of the things that we need to discuss is that, in fact, for most people in the world, there is no line. Right? You only get to immigrate if you have relatives who are close enough relatives. So this is a spouse, children, parents, and siblings of a U.S. citizen. That's it for the family categories, right? You have to have employment that's certifiable by the Bureau of Labor as being needed in the United States. You have to have an employer in the United States who's willing to file that paperwork on your behalf and wait for you to go through the process in order to hire you. Okay. There is a line for investors. This is, as we will see, one of actually the most expeditious lines if you have $1 million, or if you qualify to be considered a refugee by the United States government. Okay, this is the first time in 1965 that there will be a numeric cap on immigration within the Western Hemisphere. Okay, and this is, if you think about it, a form of equality, right? You're treating all countries the same, but because of the historic relationships between the United States and its nearest neighbors, right, there's always been a lot of back and forth, a lot of movement, sort of the sharing of space, the sharing of communities, the sharing of economies, right? As we saw yesterday with Professor Alvarez's talk, it immediately generates a set of challenges and problems, right? Because you have a law suddenly in place, but this doesn't mean that people can that abruptly change their behaviors, okay? We have in 1980 a Refugee Act that will raise admission caps for refugees. So there is more capacity to receive refugees, but there will also start to be a series of immigration acts that we will talk about later, okay, that are intended to sort of address the enforcement problems. This is the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, chiefly, okay? But there are other acts to sort of modify and adjust the immigration law to be more accommodating of actual immigration flows. One of the chief acts is legislated in 1990. This Immigration Act enacts the H-1B temporary visa program for skilled workers. So basically what is found is that under the employment preferences, the United States cannot bring in enough people under the skilled category to be employed in categories considered highly skilled. So this is expanded through the H-1B visa program, okay? It also enacts the diversity lottery visa program, okay? And so some countries, in fact, don't use up all of their visas, and this program was intended to reallocate those visas to other countries which were underrepresented in terms of immigration, or where there was sort of need of more visas. This initial incarnation of the diversity lottery program was actually intended to benefit Irish and Italians, okay? And so I will explain this. So here, all right. So this is generally available online, right? And so you can go and find it. It's sort of, there's no restrictions on accessing and using it, but we can play this game. Okay, so what part of legal immigration don't you understand? Let's see if we would qualify to immigrate to the United States, right? And this sort of sets it out very clearly, right? So, and this is to underscore that for many people there is no line. So here's the generic applicant, and there are some key questions. Do you have family in the USA? Yes. Is your relative a US citizen or lawful permanent resident? If US citizen, you have to be that person's parent, spouse, or minor child, right? If not, then you have to go down to here, okay? Let's see. Yes. All right, congratulations, you found one of the ways to come in, and then you apply, and then basically you get in line, right? So total time to immigrate and become a citizen is best case 6 to 7 years, right? If you're adult children and siblings, you go down here. Wait time depends. So currently, the biggest backlog and the longest waiting times for legal immigration to the United States, this is for people whose immigrant visas have been approved, but because there is the annual cap, the wait times in the cases of some countries are 10 years or more. Right? And the countries with the biggest backlogs are Mexico, China, India, and then also the Philippines. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So if we try to do this on the basis of employment, are you skilled? Right? And this sort of varies, right, by Department of Labor certification. It tends to focus on people who are highly educated, tends to focus on people who are on STEM fields. Although I checked and found this out, if you are a trained Chinese cook, you qualify. If you're a trained French baker, you qualify, right? If you're a trained Japanese sushi chef, you can also qualify, right? But there are, so it is selective in terms of what it acknowledges as sort of special skills. So one route is, can you prove that you are a genius? How about a star athlete or an investor? But we're talking about people like, say, Albert Einstein, right? Or sort of people with kind of exceptional sorts of skills. If yes, this is actually the shortest pathway. The investor pathway is also one of the quickest to go. I mean, but to invest, you have to participate in an approved investment program, which creates a certain number of jobs, but this is the quickest pathway. Okay. But if you're going to sort of do the regular employment route, mostly you have to have a college degree or some sort of certification, right, that verifies your special skills, right? You have to be able to prove this. And if you do, then you have to have a job offer, right? And you have to have an employer who's willing to process that paperwork for you, okay? So, are they willing to do all of this? It involves legal fees. I have many contacts in Austin who do immigration law, and this takes a long time. It's very complicated, right? And then that employer has to be willing to wait for you to actually get processed and then hired. And so you can also have long waits, right? This is it. Right? Unless you're coming as a refugee and get sort of acknowledged as a refugee, right? But many people apply to be a refugee, have accepted refugee status, but then again, if you sort of exceed the cap, and the cap for refugees is even lower, you're not coming to the United States. So in fact, it is a very narrow door. Okay, so if you have questions, you need to get the microphone and see. All right, so we come back again to this chart, right, which shows us the impact of the national quota systems, which are running roughly through 1960, very, very successful in keeping numbers very sharp, far down, right? And then the 1960 Act comes into play. It still imposes numeric quotas, right, but sort of the door is opened up, and it in fact had many unanticipated outcomes. Okay, one of the big unanticipated outcomes was in terms of who actually wanted to immigrate to the United States after the mid-1960s. So if you think about the 1965 Immigration Act, 75% of the immigration visas are supposed to go to family preference. So U.S. citizens bringing over family members. So if you're a member of Congress, who do you think is most likely to come in the greatest numbers? And we're talking at a time when the U.S. population is approximately 85% Euro-American. So you can make a projection, and in fact, this was an explicit promise offered up by Ted Kennedy, who was really continuing to advocate for this cause that his brother had believed in. It was promised by Emanuel Seller, who was a long-term advocate of immigration reform. We can change the laws to be less discriminatory, but we are not going to change the composition of people who actually immigrate. So Congress, in this, Congress didn't really understand how immigration works, right? Because by the 1960s, some programs that the United States had implemented in places like Western Europe and then also Japan to help them recover from World War II, right? And so we have the Marshall Program, in fact, had been extremely successful, so that people in Europe did not have that much incentive, right, to try to immigrate to the United States. And so we have diminishing numbers of immigrants from Europe, right? But people in parts of the world that had previously been largely shut out. So people in Asia, people in Central and South America start immigrating more and more, right? But the pathway that is open to them is through those employment categories, okay? And it produces this phenomenon of what we call brain drain, right? And then once people are here, right, through the family preference systems, they actually start bringing in more and more family members because they are motivated by the comparative economic conditions, right? The United States so much more prosperous. Even if you have a college degree in, say, library science, and I know people like this, and the only gig you can get going in the United States is to run a gas station, that still is going to earn you a higher income. You're going to have greater social stability. You're going to be part of a democratic political country, right? And so many people from unstable countries economically and politically are motivated to come to the United States. But much of that immigration is not coming from Europe, right? The exceptions to that were, in fact, Ireland and Italy, whose economies were still struggling, okay? And so this is the movie that you saw yesterday called Brooklyn, right? And the young woman in 1950s Ireland is still desperately poor, right? And that economy will take longer to sort of develop and become more prosperous. The problem, though, with 1965 is that by this time, right, you've had all of this diminished immigration across the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right? Many Irish and Italians would like to immigrate, but they don't qualify, right? Because they don't have the right employment criteria, they also don't have close enough relatives to apply for them, right? So there, in fact, is this pressure, right? But legally, they cannot be admitted. And so Congress undertakes to fix this situation, right, by passing the 1990 Immigration Act, including the diversity lottery visa program, right? And so that explicitly, Ted Kennedy, again, was an advocate for this. And so that is included, right? And you're not sort of changing the overall caps, right? But you're making sure that visas can try to go to certain populations whose immigration you want to facilitate. But as it happens, in the 1990s, this is when Ireland's economy picks up and Italy's economy picks up. And so not that many Irish and Italians have actually come. Some key beneficiaries of the diversity lottery visas have been from Africa and I think also from Central America. Okay, so these are some of the changes that have happened. And since the 1960s, literally the face of the United States has become transformed, right? We have much more in the way of an Asian population, much more in the way of a, not just Mexican, so we will have sort of a Mexican population coming in, and sort of the prior practices of having circular migration become much more difficult, right? And the pressure is then to actually try to get citizenship and choose a side, right? And if you are going to try to stay in the United States, you then need to try to remain. If you can, try to get citizenship and then bring over the rest of your family members, right? But we also have across the 1970s and 1980s actually increasing immigration from further south in from Central America and then from Latin America. And so these numbers also will be going up for a variety of reasons. And so here we have, so these graphs that I've been showing you come from Ruth Wassum, who was the congressional researcher specialization in immigration. Okay, and so she's generously shared these. And so here we have, again, another graph showing us the leading countries that are sending immigrants in certain key decades, right? And so this, in the 1900s, this was a period of an earlier period of a sense of crisis about immigration. Too many immigrants and coming from places that we are concerned that these people are not assimilating, right? They're coming in too great numbers. They're coming from places that don't sort of resonate with the earlier immigration that was chiefly from places like England, Germany, and then also places like France and Scandinavia, right? It has become Italy, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. We have another shifting out across the 1920s, 1930s. This is when the national quotas go into effect. And it sort of keeps immigration in terms of composition sort of in place, right? But after 1965, you can see there has been this transformation, right? And our closest one of our closest neighbors, right, is the chief source of immigration, right? It's no longer Canada as much. Canada and the United States are roughly equivalent in terms of political systems and also sort of economic conditions, right? And the pressure really is from Mexico, right, where there is such disparity, right, in terms of our economies, but also significant immigration from Asia, but then also elsewhere in the American hemisphere. Okay, and so these patterns have continued, right, into the present. And this is some of our sort of challenge with regard to how our immigration policy is functioning. So here, so this chart gives us another sense of tracking scale, okay, across since 1900. It's tracking legal permanent resident admissions. Okay, these are people who are arriving with immigrant visas, right? And as we've talked about, it's only people who arrive with immigrant visas, right, who then have a pathway to citizenship. These are the people we've decided to admit because we think that they should be able to settle permanently and eventually gain U.S. citizenship. Okay, and so this is the respective numbers. And as you can see presently, right, we are coming to the same peaks that we had in, say, the 1900s, right, and the 19-teens, right? And so if we feel a sense of crisis now because of the scale of immigration, it sort of mirrors what was happening about a century ago, right? But there's two big differences. One is that now the chief sources of immigration are different, right? But then also the numbers are sort of comparable, but in terms of the percentage of foreign-born, it was actually higher here, if this makes sense, right? Now here we have this addition of a set of regularization of status as a result of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, okay? And what happens in the 1980s is that there is a recognition that we continue to have a lot of immigration, but now it has become outside of the law from Mexico, but then other parts of the American hemisphere, right? And people are sort of doing what they have been doing, which is they've been working, they've been participating in communities, they've been having families, but now they're subject to being really outside of the law, right? And so we are having this problem of unauthorized immigrant population, right? And there are serious conversations, and I will say it's important to remember in the 1980s is actually really the last time we had more of a bipartisan consensus about how to handle these sets of problems, right? And we will talk more about the Immigration and Reform Control Act, which was passed in 1986, IRCA, okay? But one of the things that IRCA did, it had three main goals, but one of the goals was actually to acknowledge that we have this long-term resident population. They sort of have their lives here, they're working here. Let us undertake to allow those who don't have criminal records to actually regularize their status, right? And so this is when we get this bump. There was approximately 1.6 million people who had entered prior to, I think the date is 1982, who were allowed to regularize their status, right? And then we also had about 1.1 million who had been allowed to come in as agricultural workers and recognizing, well, these are people actually that we have recruited, we need their labor. They were also allowed to regularize their status and gain permanent standing. Okay, so this is this big bump, right? But then it did not resolve many of the problems, right? Another key thing that happens is there is, alongside of that, an effort to ratchet up resources to border enforcement and border control, the policing functions, right? And so this was the attempt to sort of make sure that the immigration regulations, in fact, are carried out effectively. Okay, this is also to help us understand who is immigrating to the United States with these immigrant visas, legal permanent residents admitted. And so this goes with the preference system. And this gives you a sense of the kinds of categories, right? And respectively, sort of the character of our immigrant population separate from countries of origin. Right? And so the big chunk actually is immediate relatives, right? These are the spouses, these are the minor children. And they, in fact, are non-quota. They are not counted under the quota system. So, you know, as long as you have this very close relationship to a U.S. citizen, you can immigrate alongside of them. Okay, so this is this is not subject to numeric controls, right? But next you have the family preferences, right, which then goes to the siblings, chiefly the adult children, and this is also a significant percentage, but this is capped. Employment is the next most significant chunk, right? Also subject to a lot of controls. We have the refugees and asylum category, and this can sort of, so refugees are subject to an annual cap, right? But not asylees. And asylees are people who apply for asylum are supposed to just apply, and then their case is evaluated. If you qualify as an asylee, you're supposed to be able to stay in the United States, okay? All right, we have, this is the numbers coming through the diversity lottery program. You can see it's actually not that significant, right? But it's in there, and then all others, right? So here we see this regularization of status, this big bump from IRCA, but one of the things we think happened in the aftermath of IRCA, right, is that people regularized their status and then they proceeded to apply for their relatives, right? Okay, so this is sort of, this gives us a sense of who's coming and how they're coming, right? Of those able to come legally. And so I'm just going to give you a little bit more information about people arriving through the different preferences, okay? So family unification, and so historically, as from the beginning of when the United States starts to seriously try to regulate immigration, family unity has always been the chief priority, right? And so even when we go back to the Chinese exclusion laws, right, and sort of that tiny group of exempt categories, if you had legal rights to enter the United States, and also if you were a man, you had the right to bring your family with you, right? So if you qualified as a Chinese merchant, you could bring your family, right? If you qualified as a student, you could bring your family with you. Okay, so this has historically always been a protected status. If we go back and look at, say, actually let's just look at here. Okay, it's in the 1920s. I mean, so before we have systematic immigration regulation, the majority of immigrants to the United States are chiefly working age men. Right, because they come, right, they work, they will make certain decisions about whether they want to stay or not, right, but most of them are coming for economic purposes, right, as Roger Daniels talks about. This is why we have sort of regularly sort of high levels of migration circulation. People come and they go back. But when the United States becomes more serious about regulating immigration in the 1920s, right, and this is applying the quotas to Europe, if people immigrate, more and more they're going to do so with their families. This is also because if under the quota system, right, you actually get an immigrant's visa, you're allowed to bring your family with you, right? And they all go under that one admission, right? And so now we have much more in the way of immigration and families, right? And it's only at this juncture in the 1920s where the immigrants who come to the United States, actually we start getting gender parity. It's roughly equal between male and female, okay? And this is because a lot of times we actually didn't place caps on family immigration, right? Does this make sense? Okay, and this carries on with 1952 and then 1965. If you're immediate family members, you're a non-quota. We're not going to count you numerically against an overall numeric cap. Okay, and so chain migration has also been the most common pattern for immigration. It is most common, and this makes sense, right? If you've in fact made this decision that you're going to immigrate, you're going to settle someplace, you want to be with your family members, right? I mean, particularly sort of your spouse and your children, but you do want to be in a complete family unit. All right. Now, so here, this again is graphs compiled by Ruth Wassum, and we're going from 1952. This is when this category is being actually written into the law explicitly and then starting to be tracked. And so we can sort of see this is just overall numbers of people immigrating as immediate relatives of U.S. citizens, right? And here's spouses and children, orphans. This is international adoptions, right? And then also parents of U.S. citizens, okay? So this is sort of, this helps us see like change over time, right? And this is just sort of in bulk numbers. It doesn't show us percentages of overall immigration, right? Here, data is then broken down by region, right? And so again, starting in 1952, sort of significant but steady levels from Europe, right? But we see real growth in two parts of the world. Asia is the green, and then North America is the red. So this would be, I think, chiefly Canada, and then also, I think Caribbean would be included in North America. I'm not sure, I'd have to check that breakdown, right? But more and more from South America. Actually, this may also include, I think this is the category then that includes Mexico and Central America too. Okay, all right. Here, parents of US citizens by sending region. Asians seem much more eager to bring over their parents as well, right? But you can see actually in terms of the actual numbers, it's not that high, right? But just in terms of sort of based on this crude categories by region, right? Who is really availing themselves of this possible immigration pathway. This is to give sort of a more up-to-date and detailed sense of who's coming in under what status. So in 2011, we had actually entering 1.1 million legal permanent residents. So immediate relatives were the biggest chunk. Next, we have family preferences. We also have refugees and asylees, employment. And as we think about this, right, and also when we think about sort of push for immigration reform, which I think people generally agree is needed, right, and there is a significant group who think that actually we need to lower the overall numbers of immigrants once again, right? But then what we then have to do is think about what categories of legal immigrants would we actually cut? How can we actually reduce the numbers, right? And so I show you this, right, in order to help you process through. These are the kinds of choices, right, and priorities that people are trying to so we are having protracted struggles about this, right? And another thing I hope that you have gotten from this sort of what we talked about so far is that in fact immigration restriction is very difficult to pass. It's difficult to get enough consensus around the specific conditions because people feel very, very strongly, right, about what kinds of immigrants, what kinds of relationships should be encouraged and preserved. It's also about projecting into our future, right? Whom we admit now sort of shapes the future of the country. So we have all kinds of It's a set of, in fact, incredibly difficult choices, right? This is 4.4 million approved pending, right? And this is important to remember, right? That there are all these people who have applied, their status has been verified, they are legally eligible to immigrate, right? But the numeric caps, right? So they are in line. These are the people who are in line, and these are the categories, right? And so, right now, one of the pushes is to actually reduce what's being called chain migration. It's actually family migration, right? And they're really taking aim at this group here, right? US siblings, right? Because it's a significant chunk, right? And the tie is not as close, but it is nonetheless a significant family tie, right? And is this in fact what we're going to cut? You know, if we decide that we in fact need to cut, okay? So, there is somewhat more of consensus about employment-based immigration, especially since we're going by the highly skilled, right? Legal immigration statuses, and this is just sort of to give you a sense of process, right? And so the Department of Labor will set forth the categories of sort of workers who qualify as highly skilled, as sort of, you know, that this is people in these kinds of fields are the ones that we want to bring into the United States. You also have to demonstrate that you're not displacing an American worker. You also need to have your employer be willing to file the paperwork, which means you're always going to have to hire a lawyer, right? So this is costly, and it's also time consuming. So members of professions or artists and scientists of outstanding ability, that's one preference, okay? Skilled or unskilled workers, of which there is a shortage in the United States. So it's mostly skilled workers, right? There's going to be some variation. You can also come in as an investor, right? Okay, so let's look at the numbers. So again, this is coming from dating after the 1952 Immigration Act, right? Where there was first preference was for people who were coming through employment, so skilled employment, right? And then here we have the numbers after 1965, great increase in terms of professional employment, right? And I think many people would say in this regard, the 1965 Immigration Act has been very, very successful, right, in enabling the United States to bring in people with sort of at least college degrees trained in particular fields, right? And this, I think, is actually one area of consensus that sort of if we're going to have an emphasis on our immigration regulation, this is the kind of immigrant we want to bring in more of, right? Okay, now, employment-based immigrants by region, okay? And so significant, steady numbers from Europe, big increase in terms of immigration from Asia, right? And if you are, so from an Asian country, if you're able to have higher education, this is this is pretty much the only way you're going to get to the United States. I will say, and it's something to track, right, that there is a disjuncture between having an educational credential and necessarily being able to find employment in that area. So we actually find a lot of people who have a college degree who cannot get, who are not sort of competitive in the sort of the primary employment market, and they end up in small businesses or starting their own firms, right? So this is one of the reasons why we have this disproportionate percentage of immigrant entrepreneurs. Okay, so lots of Asians, more and more from the Western Hemisphere, right? And we have this sort of steady and increasing presence of immigration from Africa. Okay, now employment-based immigrants and professions, and so this just sort of repeats what is already very visibly true in the United States, contributes to the sort of the image of the model minority group, right? Preponderantly in sort of white collar or technical fields, STEM fields, disproportionately so, sort of overall educational attainment levels very, very high. Well, guess what? This can also be part of policy, right? And so if we think about immigration regulation, but combine it also with international education policies, we can see there's sort of a set of strategy, right, into this kind of outcome. So if we look at doctorate production in the United States universities, extending from 1920 up to the present, right? And so we all know that there's a lot of Asian persons of Asian ancestry on university campuses. So a certain percentage are Asian American. More and more, there are more international Asian students. This has been true actually since the early 20th century, okay? A lot of international students lodged in graduate programs. Okay, also significant numbers from the Western Hemisphere. So we had talked about this, I don't think I've actually shown you this before, right? But international education programs starting from the early 20th century were one of the strategies that the United States government starts pursuing systematically to try to cultivate influence overseas, right? If you are educating people who you can project will become sort of influential persons in their home countries, it makes sense to educate them in the United States. So and there is a contradiction, right, between having sort of discriminatory immigration laws, but when it comes to students, right, students will come, they will be influenced, and they will leave. They are non-immigrants, right? And there is a big payoff. It is a relatively cheap way of having influence overseas. And this has been a growing set of programs, right? Growing numbers of international students coming to the United States. And so what this graph captures is sort of 6 key countries that have sent international students to the United States. I mean, this is from the research for my second book, right? But one of the things we can see of particular interest to me is even though we have the Chinese exclusion laws, Chinese were always among the top 1 or 2 countries to send students to the United States, right? And now, of course, it actually goes between India and China, but now China far outstrips India in terms of the numbers of students that are coming over to this country, okay? Now, a big change will happen with World War II is that there will be a growing realization that we're educating all of these very bright sort of people in very useful fields that, we are not so committed to this idea that they'll go away. We actually are willing and eager to have some of them stay and become Americans and participate in the United States, right? And so I showed you that image of Li Zhongdao and Yang Zhenning, these 2 physicists who had come to the United States for education. We go into the Cold War and suddenly it seems like an extremely good idea, right? Not to force them to go back to communist China, right? But have them stay in the United States. And this is where they both had their, the bulk of their careers. Okay, so we have laying the groundwork for a remaking. And this is also to de-emphasize, right, what had been previously the emphasis on race and national origins in terms of immigration policy, right? We need an immigration policy that helps us to bring in, right, the high caliber persons, right, who are going to sort of bring positive change to the world while we can't keep out those who will be the burdens on the rest of us, right? And this is to get smarter about immigration policy, right, even as we remove certain kinds of unacceptable discrimination. Okay, so this is just a snapshot. This is data from 2013, 2014. So if you've been on a university campus, you've seen this and experienced it, right? And just the numbers of Chinese students, international students, it's here. It's more than the combined total of India, South Korea, Arabia, Canada, and Taiwan. So these are the next highest groups, right? A lot of students are coming from India, a lot are coming from China, right? One of the big sources of change is in this group, so this is undergraduate students. More and more undergraduate students coming from China. Part of this is associated with the economic downturn that began in 2008, 2009. A lot of, and sort of also the retreat of public funding of higher education institutions, right? And so becoming more and more dependent, in fact, on the higher tuitions paid by international students, right? And so I talked to a colleague who is an administrator at a community college in Seattle, and what she explained is that we need these Chinese students to come so that we can pay for the programs for all our other students, right? It's gone from being a way of trying to cultivate influence overseas and building international relations actually to a fiscal necessity for many institutions, okay? So we have this major shift. With the H-1B visa program, right, it then becomes, there is a pathway for people who arrive to study, right, for undergraduate, but also a graduate, then to get a job in the United States, right, and remain here at least as a temporary skilled worker. Okay, so this is making this, talking about some of this relationship between higher education programs, right, and employment and immigration. Okay, so here we have in 2010 data, ethnic Asian students. We don't really have the disaggregated data between Asian international and Asian American students, right? Collected 25% of US research doctorates. A huge chunk, right, in certain STEM fields: engineering, math and computer science, physical sciences, life sciences. Okay, now I will also comment to you that it's not that there is this sort of natural affinity, right, between sort of Asians and the sciences, right? Back to the 1950s, you have oral testimony. We can discern the patterns that Taiwanese students knew that if they were to get admitted to a school in the United States, and if they could get employment, right, they would be able to figure out a way to stay in the United States. The fields in which they were most likely to be able to accomplish this was in the science and engineering fields. Very, very practical set of considerations in terms of choosing the field that you're going to study. And I also know this from family history on my father's side. 4 siblings, they all majored in the sciences. And my grandfather, who was a Confucian scholar, made sure they studied the sciences. He was not letting them go into the humanities. And they all immigrated. Okay. Now, we can see this reflected sort of the relationship to employment. Okay, about half of all Indian immigrants receiving green cards in 2011 do so through employer sponsorship. Right, and so many people can come over. They can try to get jobs coming over from India, but many of them can also try to get jobs because they're in graduate school in the United States, And, okay, predictably, right, Indian Americans lead all other groups in income and education. 70% of sort of adult-age foreign-born Indian Americans have college degrees. Right? The national average is sort of 25–30%, so this is more than doubles, right? Let's see. Percentages of recent Indian immigrants holding college degrees hit 81% in 2010, up from 52.4% in 1980, right? This is how you know that immigration law is working, right? We are sort of on this increasing trajectory, right? But it's also a skimming mechanism. Because if you compare against the general Indian population, only 10% have an opportunity to attend some sort of coursework that is sort of post-high school, right? And this can be range greatly in terms of quality, right? We are really skimming off of an elite of the Indian population, right? I think there's also another difference that you're not necessarily educated in English, but many of the Indian students attending elite institutions will already be fully conversant in English, right? So you surmount this sort of language barrier. Okay. In 2011, almost 60% of H-1B visa recipients were born in India. Okay, so the H-1B visa program is set out there, right, as just sort of an additional set of visas. The numbers can vary from year to year. Congress actually has the capacity to vary that cap, right? And it's language is neutral, right? We just want to better capacity to bring in more highly skilled workers that are needed in particular economic sectors. Most of the H-1B visas are allocated to IT companies, right? And 60% are from India, right? So there is something going on there, right? I mean, I don't think we have time to go into it, but there are certain ways in which certain kinds of preferences, right, and systems get embedded into law and practice. Okay, and so we've already looked at this chart, but but this, I think, what I've been talking about in terms of the employment preferences and how they have worked sort of make flesh out this relationship, right, between high achievement among certain immigrant populations, right? This is a lot of times sort of the high attainment of Asian Americans are used as an example, right, that the United States in fact is sort of functioning as a multiracial democracy, right? But it's also shaped sort of their high levels of attainment actually are a product of their coming as immigrants, not because they've sort of been in the United States and they've been given opportunity to get educated and to get trained and to enter into certain fields, right? And so if you weigh that against sort of the lower attainment by African Americans, right, you can see that relationship, right? Okay. We can talk more about this. This is just data. I mean, you can visit this link from the Pew Foundation. They produce a lot of sort of quantitative data and reporting. One of the things that I wanted to illustrate that we can see here is that so of the largely immigrant populations, right, which sort of reflect this model minority stereotype the most intensively, right? But the ways in which this is a product of immigration is that in 1960 we had such a tiny population of Indians in the United States, right? And so the bulk of the population, which has continued to pretty much double every decade, this just goes back to 1990, right? The bulk of that population is screened for by our immigration preferences, right? This is overwhelmingly an immigrant population, disproportionately chosen by the employment preferences, right? And so this is the power of immigration policy, right? You can do this with your immigration laws, right? It doesn't tell you what to do. It's sort of a long-standing minority population, right? How to bring them up, right? But there are other things you can do in terms of bringing in people from other countries. And so this is why brain drain is criticized, right? Let's see. All right, we don't have that much time, but this is just, this shows us 1967 people who applied to change their F1 visa is a student visa, J1 visa is cultural exchange programs, that the highest numbers were coming from Asia, right after the law changes. In fact, China, which actually was Taiwan, was the severest sufferer of brain drain, right? So very, very high numbers. But also India, and then also, I mean, Korea would be the next highest place at this point in time. I'll just go through this very quickly. Okay, and so this is just to give us a set of ways in which migration patterns can change. And so here, this tracks high levels of Taiwanese students going overseas, high levels of Taiwanese students with science in science programs, right? They don't really return, right? They stay in the United States. At one juncture, it was up to the 1970s, it was about 90% or more stay in the United States. They are mostly coming to the United States. But something happens in the 1970s, because by the 1970s, Taiwan's economy has started to develop. It's moving into an advanced economy stage. Now, part of it has to do with, that trickle of Taiwanese students who go back help to sort of set Taiwan on this path towards development, right? But another really significant component of that is actually the United States is between 1950 and 1965, investing a lot of capital in Taiwanese agriculture and then infrastructure. It's sending a host of experts over to advise Taiwan. The United States was deeply committed to Taiwan's successful economic development and eventual political stabilization, right? And so in the 1950s, 1960s, not that many jobs for these highly trained sort of technicians, engineers, and scientists, but by the time you get to the 1970s, right, this has changed, right? And so there's more and more incentive for people to start going back. Okay, so this is something to think about, right, in terms of if we're thinking about how to manage our immigration flows, that actually if we help certain countries, right, to advance economically, we can then start managing that immigration better, right? And in the case of Taiwan, but there have been other places, Japan, right? And then as we were talking about these European countries with the Marshall Plan, the United States has done this in the past. You know, quite, in fact, successfully. But, you know, but so this is, I'm not going to go into these, but this sort of captures. And so right now, Taiwan is actually a sort of a leading manufacturer of certain components in the IT industry, right? A lot of these corporations and research facilities, manufacturing firms are based here in the Hsinchu area, right? And so we have a new transnational phenomenon. So what happens to many of these sort of scientists and technicians is that they start working in Silicon Valley, right? So they sort of establish a sense of the field. They're participating in cutting edge research. They are working with kind of the leading edge companies in this area, right? They also get a understanding of how you actually raise capital, right? And then at a certain juncture, they realize, well, it makes sense actually to relocate some of the manufacturing over to Taiwan, right? And they are in a better position to do this because they already have these experiences in California, right? And this is, they actually are key actors in the globalization of both the United States and the Taiwan economy. Okay, does this make sense? We also see this phenomenon a lot with Indian American engineers, right? And so there is actually a fairly integrated relationship between, again, Silicon Valley and computer IT businesses in India, right? And so this is another reason why you have such a disproportionate number of the H-1B visas also going to Indian workers, right? So there is a way in which there actually is a very close integration between immigration policy and certain kinds of economic development. Okay. All right, refugee and asylee. So this has been sort of at the forefront of most recent events, right? And so this is just to mark out the difference between refugees and asylum seekers. So refugees, the key difference is that refugees will apply for refugee status and then try to apply for a refugee immigrant visa while they're away from the United States. So they're in some sort of location. Many refugees are in camps. One of the key aspects of being a refugee is that you're facing persecution and unsafe conditions in your homeland. You cannot go back, right? But refugees, before they come to the United States, have already been vetted and authorized. They already have that immigrant visa, right? But as I said before, you can go through all of these processes, right? But if the United States has hit its cap, that annual cap of how many refugees it's going to admit, you have to wait, right? So there is another line. Asylum seekers, but I will add this, but you can see the way in which the United States then gets to control refugee admissions, right? Because you just have that number, right? You can say each year we know we're only going to admit this number of refugees. One of the sort of the tensions and concerns around asylum seekers is that you don't have the same control, right? So the international law and US law is that asylum seekers, right, can come to the United States and request asylum, right? And then their case is supposed to be evaluated. This is the law, right? But the United States can't control then, right, the numbers, who's going to apply. You're just supposed to take them in and then evaluate their cases and then make a decision, yes or no, right? This also goes to the levels of resources needed to actually evaluate those cases. They have to be adjudicated. And, you know, so there are all of these kinds of competing concerns, right? But so this is sort of the international law, and these are the sort of what is required of the United States. So the United States can apply its own set of criteria regarding who is considered a asylee or not, right? I will say there actually is an executive order in place which says that women who are fleeing domestic abuse actually should be considered as asylees, right? And this is being changed. The government is supposed to follow the principle of non-refoulement, right? Which is that you can't force people to go back, right? So if you force them to go back, they are in danger. We know that some people have been forced to go back and in fact have been killed. So this is another part of international law. Okay, so this is, so this tracks sort of numbers and then places of origin of refugees since 1975, which of course was fall of Saigon, and we will have a big surge in terms of Southeast Asian refugees from Vietnam, but also Cambodia and Laos. The Hmong are also a prominent population. Let's see, and so it's political events around the world, and the United States will change its definition and standards of what groups of populations it is considering to be refugees. And so if this were to go further back to say 1960, we would have a significant influx of refugees coming in from Cuba, right? Okay, but so we can see numbers here. We have a response to what was happening in Kosovo, right? Now, and so this is just refugees. So this is pre-arranged, sort of pre-authorized immigration by refugees. Okay. Now, this is major refugee and asylum acts. So this here we have 1966 Cuban Resettlement Act, and this sort of sets forth a set of resources and programs and policies to help Cubans actually make their lives in the United States. And so help sort of support for a period of time, having a place to stay. The idea is eventually you will get employed, right? And I'm sure many of you know sort of Cuban exiles. There is still a very strong sentiment of eventual return, right? But this was a real struggle. But because this was definitely an anti-communist movement, right? And so Cubans have received some of the best conditions in terms of sort of acknowledgement of their refugee status, and then also resources to remake their lives in the United States. And so of the Latino populations, actually Cubans show some of sort of the highest attainment levels. We have the 1975 Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act, brings in primarily Vietnamese, but then also some Cambodians, right? So Ted Ngoy, the Donut King, right, comes in at this juncture in 1975. And, and after the United States, more than 2 decades sort of involvement in Vietnam, right, and sort of, the United States feels tremendous obligation. It's also anti-communist, right? And so refugee status has been determined primarily by politics, right? Okay, 1980 Refugee Act was legislated. This is one of the last things that Jimmy Carter does, but he wants a more permanent refugee status that allows the United States to be more responsive to crises as they arise. Okay, and so this is legislated. The 1990 Act, this is partially a response to, across the 1980s, all right, and this shows up sort of the politicization of refugee relief. Across the 1980s, the United States has increasing levels of people arriving seeking asylum from places like Guatemala and El Salvador, right? And so there are very, very high levels of violence. There are authoritarian governments. And some of this is the product of earlier U.S. involvement in these areas, right? But you sort of have this big surge of Central Americans arriving to the United States claiming asylum. And they are defined as economic refugees, right? They're just seeking, to sort of find a better place to have jobs, not as political refugees. And so their claims are turned down, right? And there will be a series of extensive protest movements. I don't know how many people, I think most of you actually, I was in college, so I remember these marches, right? There's extensive sets of protests around this sort of denial of their claims, right? And it actually leads to changes in policy. One thing is that the 1990 Immigration Act provides for temporary protected status, right? They can stay, right, until their cases are decided, right? And in the meanwhile, a series of cases are filed. We have the American Baptist Church's cases filed to sort of require the United States actually to change its process for evaluating asylum, right, in a way that more of these cases actually can be recognized and can be accepted, right? And so more of the Salvadorans and Guatemalans are actually able to legally regularize their status. Okay, now, and this is also another act further along this line. The 1992 Chinese Student Protection Act followed in the aftermath of the 1989 student protests in China, right? And so massive demonstrations, very well publicized around the world, right? And so some of the student leaders were able to flee, right? But then there were already many Chinese students in the United States. And this act provides them actually with amnesty, that it allows them to regularize their status, right? Also folded in there were protections for people protesting the one-child policy in China, right? But so this is also anti-communist, right? But there's and there has historically been tremendous sympathy for Chinese students, right? And so various working out of refugee and asylum policy. The Zavidas case was to rule that if somebody is seeking asylum, right, or is trying to sort of have their status worked out or adjudicated, you can't keep them in detention indefinitely. Right, that this is in fact unlawful, that there are in fact limitations on the plenary power of the federal authorities in this kind of situation. Okay, all right, so this is some of the key cases. This is another way of looking at refugee admissions. They're broken down again by region. Okay, so I will share this with Dave and then he can share this with you and you can go back and look at some of the data more. And so it's also important to remember that actually the bulk of immigration is of non-immigrant entries, right? And this is just sort of to think about who these people are, right? But then it's also a kind of a tricky area as well because we actually know that roughly 60% of people who become unauthorized immigrants in fact arrive legally through these non-immigrant visas, right? And as I said before, it's not illegal, it's not officially a crime, right? It's a civil infraction to overstay your visa. Right, but then it does leave you vulnerable to sort of significant kinds of what would be punitive measures, right? Because there are people who have just sort of stayed. I know of people who sort of applied for asylum and then got denied, but they had been here many years, or the case sort of fell through the cracks, but then are picked up and they're deported, right? Because they fell out of status. If this makes sense, right? Okay, so these are just visas which document your legal rights of entry, but to remember there are many different kinds of visas, right? And they have sort of different conditions attached. I mean, at a basic level you can enter, but is it a tourist visa? Does it allow you to work? How long does it allow you to stay, right? We have exchange program visas. I have a student from China. Her J1 visa has just been approved. She's participating in the Fulbright program. We're very excited. F is for students. H1 is the temporary highly skilled workers. We also have a temporary visa program for temporary unskilled workers. Okay, all right, so this is a general category. These are considered non-immigrant, right? Okay, so this is just to give you sort of a sense of scale, right? Non-immigrant visas issued by the U.S. Department of State, so millions, right? This is operating at much higher levels than the immigrant visas, right, which are for permanent settlement. This is non-immigrant admissions at U.S. ports of entry. 180,000 million, right? And then these are the I-94 admissions. According to Ruth, the I-94 admissions are the, so when you actually go through the immigration process, they issue an I-94 just to register that you've entered. Okay, so, but compared to sort of immigrant entries, this is operating at a much higher level, right? this is for the non-immigrant visas issued, and this is to give you a sense of, again, distribution, right? Temporary workers are a significant chunk, and then cultural and employment exchange, right? So these are sort of maybe programs that would last like a few years, a few months. Okay. Now, enforcement, right? Okay. And this is where we've had a lot sort of more attention and controversy. This sets out more of the terms of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, right? And it sort of identifies areas which the 1965 Immigration Act don't handle well. We still haven't worked out good procedures, right, for really managing the sort of roughly 11, 12 million presently unauthorized immigrants in the United States, right? You know, one of the challenges, the reality is that, you know, most of them, in fact, are not criminals. Most of them have jobs. Most of them have families, but they just lack that formal sort of legal standing, right? And what do we do about this population, right? We don't want this population to keep growing. What do we do about the people who are here? You know, it's how do we develop a policy, right, that is sort of humane and recognizes what the conditions under which we are operating, right? At the same time, I think most people would prefer that we're sort of not enacting the kinds of enforcement measures that are now being employed. Right? And so this is sort of one of our quandaries. But this is to set forth efforts in the past, right? The Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA, okay. And so it addressed these problems, right? A bipartisan congressional committee was set up, right? And they came up with these strategies as an effort to sort of deal with the problem as it was emerging. This is now, 40 years ago, right? So it's a long-standing set of issues. There were 3 legs, right? Tougher border enforcement, right? And what we will see is that the resources given over to border enforcement agencies will steadily be increasing, right? So more resources, more staffing, right? There's been sort of a elaboration, more building actually of walls, right, or fences. There's also extensive use of technology. So, for example, drones are used extensively to sort of police certain areas, and then certain areas are just really, really inhospitable. Although CJ seems to be implying that if we tank the US economy, there won't be this sort of employment suck and people won't be motivated to come anymore, but that's not, that's not a realistic option. All right. Penalties for employers who hired unauthorized immigrants, right? And so there is an effort to introduce this aspect of immigration enforcement and a recognition, right, that one of the reasons, the chief reason that so many people are coming and then staying on is that people are hiring them against the law, right? And so this is another enforcement branch. And then legalization for unauthorized immigrants who have been in the US for 5 years or more. Right, and this is recognition, right, that they've been here, they've had jobs, they've had families. It's goes to the social citizenship aspect, right, and sort of recognizing that we have to sort of acknowledge that these people actually now have claims on U.S. society, right? And so, 1.6 million were able to regularize their status. 1.1 million sort of agricultural workers who were here also allowed to go from temporary to permanent status. Okay. It didn't work, right? You still continue to have high levels of illegal border crossings. One of the outcomes that people think happened is that people rushed to sort of regularize their status and then tried to bring in family members, right? But then this produced very long waiting lines, right? And then so people are still trying to come outside of the law. Right? We have this ongoing migration. And so a further effort to strengthen enforcement aspects is legislated in 1996. This is in the Clinton administration. Construction of barriers, increasing penalties and sanctions on employers, and trying to continue. Another problem with the sort of penalties for employers was then sort of a ballooning of document fraud, right? It was, in fact, hard to sort of figure out a system that can reliably evaluate people's statuses and identities, right? And we have yet to sort of hit that point either. And so trying to ratchet up things again in 1996. Okay. Still not that successfully. But so this gives you sort of, this tracks the expansion of resources for Border Patrol, right? For Border Patrol budget and Border Patrol officers, right? Steadily increasing, okay? This is a breakdown, I think, going up to 2013, 2014. And so this also is another breakdown: budget, staffing, where the Department of Homeland Security money goes. So this is 2015. So we can see this breakdown. This is federal emergency, right? This is Border Patrol, Secret Service. This is the sort of the immigration processing, right? But this is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Right, and this is the Transport Security Administration. Okay, so this also gives you a sense. And so here you see the relative size of the various agencies by number of employees. Somehow the Coast Guard doesn't get that much money, but it has a lot of employees. Okay. But so we're devoting more and more of our our domestic budget to this kind of problem and this challenge, right? Okay. Border Patrol apprehensions actually seem to have gone down, right? And so this is one way of tracking. I think I have a slide for tomorrow, which I think it's sort of been going up. But so we're spending more money, but we're not necessarily becoming more effective, right, in terms of resolving these sets of problems. This is also another aspect of enforcement, right? That visas are denied, right? You know, immigrant and non-immigrant, because people don't qualify. You know, and so there is this relationship, right, particularly between the non-immigrant visa and people overstaying, right, is that for certain countries where consular authorities consider you more likely to overstay your visa and try to immigrate permanently, it is much harder, in fact, to get that visa, right? You know, so someplace like, in fact, say the Philippines, very hard to get even a tourist visa, right? Okay, but so this is an enforcement strategy. These are denials of legal permanent residence applications. If you have been a public charge, right, or if you're considered likely to become a public charge, that's still at play. Removals and illegal presence, if you in fact have been removed, right? And so you were asking about this, we'll go into this. An illegal presence, if you've had a prior sort of conviction or record of this, you also cannot then come back, okay? Labor certification problems, right? And I have friends who are immigration attorneys, and this is getting harder and harder to get. Okay, but so this is the problem, right? And we'll return to this tomorrow, right? Is this significant level of an unauthorized population who are legally, right, have just sort of diminished rights and protections, right? And this is sort of a long-standing population. And what do we do about this population, right? We need to somehow resolve this problem. Okay, and so this is what we looked at yesterday, deportations from the United States, which is the red line. Deportation numbers are actually going down, right? But so this graph was actually compiled by Adam Goodman, who's also a historian. So I went back and looked. What he's concerned about is that removals are actually on the increase, right? So rather than deporting people, right, which if you recall, requires that you're first evaluated to see if you actually should be deported, right? You have a hearing before an immigration court. If you are formally deported, right, then you're not allowed to come back, and you sort of go down in the record. So this is why a lot of people opt for returns, right? Voluntary return, you just leave, there's no record, you can come back eventually. But more and more what's happening, according to Adam, is that we have a rise on the numbers of removals as a strategy. And the removal is the same thing as a deportation, very similar to a deportation, except you don't get a hearing. You're just summarily removed, right? And you are put on record. You can be banned from coming back for, for 10 years or longer, right? And then if you get repeated removals, so if you get removed again, you are banned permanently. Okay, and so this is this distinction. So it is sort of a ratcheting up of the enforcement measures. Okay, so this is from Ruth, 22-year trends in alien removals. Again, tracking similar phenomenon. This one looks sort of more authoritative, doesn't it? But yeah, but this would go to Congress, right? So, and this is to track the criminal aliens, and we can see this is the percentage of overall removals, right? So actually a lot of people who are being removed in this way, in fact, are not criminals, right? But they're being removed nonetheless. Okay, so this is sort of we are at just past 10, right? That's a lot of information. This, if we want to go to it, is just going back to that New York Times. Over time, we can look at the map and see places where people settled. You can go to that yourself, but we could sort of see how the demographics of different areas of the United States have changed as a product of the 1965 Immigration Act. We could also sort of have questions, because you've been very good about holding your questions. So should we just go to questions? I'm sure there are some parts that were sort of confusing or need clarification.
Hello. My question is regarding overstaying one's visa. What are the penalties instituted for overstaying one's visa? And if this is a big problem, have there been efforts made to make that more punitive?
You can be removed, right? So you can be removed, you can be deported, right? And so this is, that's the punishment, right? But it's regarded as a civil infraction. So it's like getting a traffic ticket, right? But so you're not formally a criminal, right? But you're subject to removal. Right, and so there was a couple of years ago, we had a UT student, right, whose family had arrived and they had applied for asylum, and it had gone on for years and years, right? And so she had sort of lived a good portion of her life here in Texas. She was enrolled at the University of Texas, and then the family's case was decided against them, right? And then the family just the parents were removed, and just a couple weeks later, and so we sort of knew this was happening, and then the student was also removed. So this is, and so it's also to, we call it things like deportation, removal, right? But to think about these, if we actually considered them as punishments, right? It really is sort of extreme, right? Sort of removing people for life from this place where they've actually really sort of made their lives. In many more and more cases now, it's involving family separations, right? And so if you have like the US born kids and one of the parents doesn't have status and they're removed, either that entire family has to move with them, right? Or we're talking about separating that family forever, right? And that is, that's something to think about, right? That is, in fact, if we're to think about it as a form of punishment, it's actually an extreme punishment. And sort of to think about relative to what is actually going on, right? The dynamics of why people come, why they sort of come without authorization, why they overstay a visa, weighed against sort of the outcomes, right? And this is, I think, something that we actually sort of have to set on the table and factor in as we're trying to figure out what we do in this situation. Okay. Yes, so the person, okay.
Yeah, you were saying that more money is being spent on border control, and yet it's not as effective in minimizing the unauthorized either entries.
We haven't resolved the problem, right? And so one of the measures of that is to sort of look at the who is actually being caught at the border, right? People may be choosing other ways to get into the United States. We sort of still have the persistence of this population. We also have, and so when we talk about tomorrow, sort of the operations of various travel bans, right? And sort of there's sort of the legality of it, and then also sort of their effectiveness actually as policy, right? And so there is this set of trade-offs of what is being claimed in the name of increasing these budgets and sort of increasing sort of size of certain agencies and what we're actually accomplishing. And then also other kinds of trade-offs, right, that we're making in this process, right? And so, so I had allocated that to talk more about tomorrow. Yes.
So if a country doesn't meet its quota for refugee visas, are those redistributed to other countries as refugees?
So one of the things that's happened recently is that the United States, in fact, has not been filling its refugee quota. So we actually have more refugee visas allocated. This is in the past year and a half than we've actually been sort of admitting refugees, right? You know, so it's part of the process, right, to be sort of have your qualifications as a refugee verified, but then, you know, one of the final steps is actually to get that refugee visa from the United States, and the United States simply has not been issuing them, right? And certain countries it actually cut off altogether from receiving refugee visas. But it's if you want to, I mean, this isn't going to give you numbers, but it's it gives you a sense of the international scope of this problem. The Chinese artist Ai Weiwei has made a documentary called Human Flow. He got help from a lot of different very good filmographers and directors, so it's visually stunning, but it's also incredibly depressing, right? Because he visits a lot of refugee camps around the world, right? And it really is, I mean, to me, it underscores this problem of people in places they're not supposed to be, right? And so massive refugee camps, right? You know, and so we know so for example, with many of the Southeast Asian refugees who come to the United States, they spent years, you know, some of them more than a decade in these refugee camps in Thailand, right? Unless they're given a visa, I mean, right now, many countries which are sort of politically stable, economically prosperous, are fighting not to take refugees, right? This is one of the big conflicts that's sort of really undermining the European Union. It's not the case that, you know, if one country doesn't take them, somebody else will, right? And so this is one of the things we're struggling. There are massive refugee camps in Turkey, right? It's you know, this is another set of problems, but we have not resolved them. So, but Human Flow is actually on Netflix. You could watch it. It's really long, but it's really sobering. Oh, Lisa, she's had her hand up. Here.
Thank you. I'm looking at the labor and aspect, and you made a comment that they have to prove that they are not displacing an American worker. And I just can't understand, you know, from a practical standpoint of an employer, how that's proven. What kind of documentation would you have to have?
I don't know. I don't actually know. I mean, you'd have to ask an immigration attorney, but that is supposed to be one of the criteria. So that is written into the 1965 Act, right? But then how you actually put that into policy, right? You know, so sort of organized labor, labor representatives, right, have consistently, and this was one of the rationales for the Chinese Exclusion Act, right, sought to make sure that there wasn't unfair competition, right? So that gets written into the 1965 Immigration Act. I'm not sure how you actually, in fact, prove it. So, but that is one of the things that, one of the boxes you would have to check. Yeah.
Thank you.
You mentioned the presence of international students at a lot of universities and how they depend on them. So, and then you also point out that there's a contingent that do well and go on to achieve like doctorates in the United States. But I'm wondering also, are there some who struggle because obviously English is not their first language, and is there a dropout rate with that population too?
I don't know about dropout rates, right? But, you know, and at UT we get students, I mean, the students from China that I have had have just been, you know, sort of really first class. I mean, really proactive students, just a real pleasure to have in class. Of course, that's also, you know, there's a little self-selecting if they're taking a class on like Asian American history, right? They're really interested. But it's the students who are less prepared coming over from China who then sort of are lodged in sort of less selective programs, and there are real issues, right? And and so at the community college level, you in fact, if you're going to be admitting students, you also need to make provisions for the fact that they are international students, and language is difficulties. They've probably had sort of preparatory coursework that is not exactly in alignment with what you would expect from sort of a domestically educated US student, right? And so they're actually, in fact, I think many of these programs, in fact, do not serve the international students well either, right? And there's also, a strong sense of sort of a consumer's rights, right? These students know that they are coming, they're paying a lot of money, and they have a certain level of expectation, right? So this is not to say that these students actually, are necessarily a good fit, right? So it can be very, very problematic. Yeah.
Hi, my question today has to do with this idea of brain drain. You just presented to us this theory of brain circulation, and you looked at Taiwan and the circulating of people back there. Mm-hmm. So my question has to do outside of Asiatic nations, outside of places like India and China, where people do return and come back and circulate. How is brain circulation affecting those other nations and those other parts where we've seen a demographic shift in who's coming to the United States? For example, parts of Africa and other countries.
I don't have specific research on that. I don't know that they've been studied, but Violet Chavez-Johnson should know. So she sent me information for her introduction, and it's an impressive set of credentials. I think she would have a better sense of perhaps there are scholars who are starting to work on this. I don't know, what the scholarship is. For the research that I've done, the main scholar who works on this is named Annalise Saxenian, but the population she's looked at are sort of Taiwan, China, India, and then also Israel, but not yet Africa. So, but Violet would know, yeah.
My question is also in relation to the brain drain. What are some strategies that countries have taken to mitigate the flow of those students to keep them in their own higher education systems and to retain some of those higher level students seeking education?
So this is one of the things that I was thinking about as I was focusing on international education and its relationship to immigration, is that there are certain kinds of migration which actually are really facilitated by both sending and receiving countries, right? And so international education is actually one of these areas. So the United States is doing it because there is a realization this is one of the ways in which we can cultivate international influence. We actually like foreign students, even those from like sort of non-white countries, right? Because they are the elites, right? We like this kind of person, And so when I say that Americans like Chinese students, it's deeply, deeply true. From the perspective of sending countries, it's actually also very useful, right? And so if we look at countries that don't have as much in the way of higher education, training, and research facilities, because they haven't yet developed them, it's actually a good thing to be able to send your students away, right? The trick is eventually getting them to come back, right? And so Taiwan is the case that I know the best. Government observes a lot of these students are just sort of staying away. We would like them to come back. But there also is a seed of recognition that even if they came back, our economy is not at a point where we could, in fact, usefully employ that many of them, right? And so let them stay away, but sort of track it and eventually provide incentives to try to encourage them to come back, right? And so this is a very active strategy for certain countries that rely a lot on sort of export of persons, right? But that there are, we don't think about this as much in the United States because we think mostly about people coming here, but for countries which rely a lot on being able to send people away, there is a systematic tracking and a set of programs to try to get people to come back, or at least send back resources, right? Send back capital, send back remittances, but also to share expertise, right? And and so there's one, I'm forgetting his name, But he comes over to the United States, studies computer science, goes into the IT industry, and so he invests in establishing sort of IT programs. I think it's at Michigan State, but then also at universities back in India, right? And so this is somebody who can sort of perform multiple functions, right? With the Indian IT industry, I remember reading this account, right, that so many of the pioneers of India's computer industry come and study in the United States, right? They go back to India, and many of them are instrumental in establishing the Indian Institutes of Technology, right, which is one of the main sort of higher education programs for this. And there is a juncture at which they have to decide, are they going to go with IBM or like the computer mainframe system in England, right? And they pick IBM. Right? And so this means that sort of in terms of educational systems, but it also means in terms of global businesses, right? They're oriented towards the United States. It's this kind of sort of relationship, and so that these are people who are sort of integrated into advancing globalization or certain kinds of economic relationships. And we also have to remember this is not sort of a win-lose situation, right? It is sort of a set of collaborations which advances the interests of the participants, right? So this is, this is one of the ways to think about that, kind of the benefits, right, of migration. And to think of brain drain not as loss, although that's how it was understood early on, but that it can also be sort of a form of helping you develop economically. If sort of the economies of the homeland countries get to that level. Right, so we don't have this happening in comparable ways in, say, in the Philippines, right? Yeah, but it's to think of what are kinds of the possibilities of this. So do we have, okay, let's take one last question, and then I think I should let you guys go because then we have a session with, you have a session with Dave.
I'd like to know, I believe you said earlier that Salvadorian refugees or asylum seekers were rejected based on economic reasons. Can you go into further detail about how that was justified?
So they were categorized as economic refugees, right? Because the U.S. administration didn't want to have to deal with them, right? Didn't want to have to sort of acknowledge their kinds of claims, right? And allow them to settle in the United States. And the way to do this is to portray them as economic refugees, not political refugees. So they don't fit the definition of refugee that the U.S. government is choosing to employ, right? And this is a similar kind of differentiation that was applied to Cubans as opposed to Haitians, right? And there were a lot of protests around this and just pushback, which led to sort of these court cases and then also modifications in policy, right? And so one of the things that happens with the American Baptist Church's settlement, right, is that a different process for evaluating asylum is then produced, and then they go back and they reevaluate the cases. Right, and so people have managed to stay in the United States, right? And this is where the sanctuary movement actually sort of has its genesis in the discussion of sanctuary. And then so a lot of people were able to have their cases reevaluated and then be recognized as asylum seekers and then stay on in the United States, right? And so this is, but it's how you legally categorize, right? And it was, and it was pointed out, this is just a choice that the U.S. government is deciding to make because they don't want to have to deal with these people. So, okay, so, yeah, not that cheerful way to end. But, but we will talk about post 9/11, and then we also have a final session where we can sort of think about how history is a part of, sort of our present and our future. And then maybe we can come up with something more cheerful to think about. All right, thank you. And